All right. Okay, I think we are live. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick Milliken from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And for those of you who are longtime customers and viewers, you'll know that I'm the big noir enthusiast here at the store. And so I'm really delighted to have Gregory Galloway with me this afternoon, talking about his really wonderful book, Just Thieves, which just came out. And Gregory was kind enough to sign a bunch of them for us. Here's his signature right here. And actually, we're almost sold out. So I may hit you up, Gregory, to sign a new batch for us.
We'd love to.
Yeah, but welcome to our little program here. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Particularly delighted to be with you guys at Poison Pen and everybody for joining.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to have you out here in person at some point, maybe for your next book. That would be great.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
But it's interesting, we've talked to a lot of authors about, this bizarre pandemic world we've been in, and some of the real nice benefits of it, which has been, all these virtual events, and really enjoy doing them. They, we miss the energy of having a live audience, of course, but I don't know, these conversations can take on an interesting intimacy, and sometimes we get into strange digressions. And if I go too far off track, you may have to reel me back in. But
there's probably nothing too far off track for me.
And everybody watching on YouTube and Facebook, welcome. I'm flying solo this evening, so if you have questions for Gregory, go ahead and put them in the comments or the chat field, depending upon which platform you're on, and I'll do my best to monitor those questions. And also, if you'd like to order one of the last remaining signed copies, I will put a link in the comments field as well, if I can manage it while talking to Gregory. So anyway, let's get into it. This book, there's so much to discuss in this book. So I thought what I would do, just to kind of kick off the conversation, is to have you just tell us a little bit about the book and the basic setup, the basic framework for the story, and then we'll do a deeper dig.
Yeah, I think that the basic setup is that the book involves two professional thieves, the narrator and his partner Frank, and they mostly rob houses. And I think what's unusual about them is they don't rob for themselves. They sort of rob objects for hire. And they have a somewhat mysterious boss named Fromer, who the narrator has known since he was a child and sort of has gotten involved with from doing a favor. Fromer did a favor for the narrator, and that sort of put him down the slippery slope of paying back that debt. And that's sort of one of the key parts of the narrator's life, is he has a lot of debts, some monetary, some obligations. He has a child with his high school girlfriend who he feels he needs to take care of. Sort of all of those confluence to this one job where they go to another town, and just things start going wrong the minute they hit town.
Right. So it in some ways it's sort of a classic noir setup anyway. But there's at the back of the book, and not to spoil it, but there's a list of some of the disparate influences that fill the book, and you make really sly little nods to all sorts of different films and classic noir. Is this your first sort of foray into this world of noir? Have you been a follower, a reader of it for a long time? Or
it's really, like, if not my first love, like second or third love. As a kid, I probably wasn't reading noir, but I was reading, Agatha Christie, and probably before that Encyclopedia Brown, but sort of found the noir genre pretty early on, probably if not late grade school, then certainly junior high. And Hammett was my guy for a long time, and then got into Chandler, and then people like Dorothy B. Hughes, Cornell Woolrich, and on and on and on. So fairly steeped into that. And then as I worked on the book, spent a lot of time going back and rereading some of that stuff, discovering new stuff, and especially looked at read a lot about heist books, thieves in noir as well as film, and that's sort of where the acknowledgments came from, sort of wanting to do a little bit of larceny as a writer and steal a little bit from things that influenced me and put them in there.
Right. Now can you talk a little bit about, there's this wonderful, there's a sort of a noir worldview really that informs this whole book in a lot of ways. And we get little bits of it, as we read the book. But I don't want to put words into your mouth, but it's sort of the classic thing that in this fallen world, we're all thieves, of one kind or another. We're all in some ways complicit in this huge con, that we call modern society, whether we realize it or not. Can you talk a little bit about and by the way, the French are going to love this book. It's not already published over there.
Yeah, well, George Simenon was a big influence on this, and he sort of has what I think is one of the great lines of noir, which is I think it's from The Widow, where he says, he waited for the things to happen that had been decided long before, which sort of this concept of fate, and I think that's sort of
Right.
at the heart of noir fiction, as well as fate versus free will. And what role does choice have in noir? And oftentimes noir is guys who think they have it figured out, but every choice they make just demonstrates how little they have it figured out. And sort of I like that concept, and certainly like that concept for this novel in particular.
Right. Well, it's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit in depth about. I want to ask you about, the two partners, Rick and Frank, in more detail. Frank is sort of the philosopher of the pair, although Rick is too in a way. But it's interesting. I was talking with an old friend about the comparisons between this existential noir view and Zen philosophy. There are quite a few parallels, and sometimes when I was reading, for those of you watching, Frank, the character, he has just these wonderful musings, and some of which seemed a little bit Zen to me in the way he was talking. In particular, I think he said, you were just talking about sort of the vanity of making plans, and he said everybody's autobiography should be told in passive voice, which I thought was a wonderful quote. Can you talk a little bit about Frank and sort of where he comes from?
And so both Frank and the narrator are recovering addicts. They met in recovery, and part of Frank giving back is he does teach, I think the narrator calls it the greatest hits of Western literature. So, he teaches a little class at the addiction center, recovery center, and that sort of leads to his philosophical musings. But it's also, I think, part of that addiction. He really tries to control his life. I sort of compare it to like Nick Adams in Hemingway. Nick Adams is focusing on making spaghetti, fishing, all of these tiny things so he doesn't have a nervous breakdown. And Frank is a little bit like that, to the point where he comes off as superstitious. So he tries to control the job in such a way that if anything happens in the world, he takes it as a sign to how their planning should proceed. And I think that sort of control mechanism is a driving force, and it's also, as sort of complicates their life as they move forward.
Right. Well, it's funny, as a team, they kind of complement each other, or you think they do early on.
Yes.
And as you say, Frank is the meticulous observer, and he's the one that, part of his skill set is he's able to just sit and observe, and all the quotidian detail, he's on it.
And part of that is from Hammett as well, which Hammett talks about the world as a machine, and if we can only pry the lid off the machine and look at the mechanism, we can figure out the world. And Frank sort of has that worldview as well. If you observe things long enough and in great detail, you can figure it out and you can use the world to your advantage instead of the world using you.
Right. You know, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned that bit of Hammett. Do you remember in the Maltese Falcon, that famous what was it called, the Flickcraft or
Flickcraft.
episode?
Mm-hmm.
You know, whenever I've been leading a discussion group here, Hard Boiled and Noir group for 20 years now, and for me, it's like that little episode is so important to the understanding of noir, or at least
Yeah, I had a detective film class when I was in college, and the professor really thought that was the Rosetta Stone of all noir as well, that Flickcraft story. And it's not in there for very long. It's obviously not in the movie, but it sort of sums up a lot of noir right in a couple paragraphs.
Right, right. I don't know if we should explain it to the viewers or tantalize them enough to go check it out, but
Yeah, I'll say this about Flickcraft. So Spade talks about a case that he's on, and this man Flickcraft has disappeared, and his wife doesn't know where he's gone or why he's disappeared. And Spade finds him, and he discovers that I think it's a construction beam almost falls on him, and it allows him this insight into the machine, Spade thinks, and that he re-examines his life and he abandons the life that he had. And that's about all I want to say, because Spade does discover what his new life is like. And it's pretty surprising.
Right. There's also this notion when you're talking about the machine there, and that whole about prying the lid off and seeing the works. There's also this sort of recurring element in noir that you know, there's another world underneath this world of appearances that we live in that's governed by chaos, you know, where chaos rules supreme. And Frank talks a little bit about that throughout the book. You know?
Yeah, it's one of the things that they discuss, which is that people look at the world, but they don't see the world. And that is that, you know, they're passive observers in the world. And if they would actually see the world, then they would discover things. And of course, you know, in classic noir fashion, that occurs to especially the narrator, where he has looked at things, but he hasn't truly seen them.
Well, absolutely. And then, you know, I realize people that are watching, we're getting into some pretty esoteric territory here, but that's just part of the gig. And let's talk about things, material objects, and you know, obviously these guys are thieves, and we can talk about, well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the importance of objects and how they function in this book. Can you talk a little bit about materialism and the kind of subtle underlying critique of materialism that goes throughout the book?
Yeah, so one of the ways they think they've figured out the world is they're not greedy, or they perceive themselves as not greedy. They're thieves for hire, so they sort of aspire to a middle class, I guess, lifestyle. And they think that if they only steal a little, that they'll be fine. They'll sort of be able to live a nice, modest life, maybe go to Italy on vacation every once in a while, and that's it. And they do sort of comment about the things that they steal, which is everything from very expensive watches, which they think are obsolete in the world that we live in, very expensive sneakers. And then ultimately, they realize that these things, they might be worth money, but they have no value. And the things that have value are the things that you can't put a price on. And that's ultimately the object that they steal that gets them in trouble, which is something that really has no perceptible monetary value, but all of these forces are then looking for this thing that they've taken.
Right. And there's let's see, there's a little, you know, little notes and stuff. There's a great little line that says, stuff that has value can be replaced, he had said. A house, car, money, almost anything you can buy again. But sentimental stuff, family stuff, ex-girlfriend stuff, your kid's first drawing, whatever means something, let's see, whatever means something that no one would care about but you, that's the stuff that's worth the most. Think about it. If you could only take one thing in the world with you, what would it be? You know, you know, when we meet this character, they've started this job, and it actually starts with a dead horse, which is another homage of sorts, I think.
Yes. There's a book that has a very famous dead horse in the street. But I just want to get back to that passage that you read. I'm glad that you read that. Those are the first paragraphs that I wrote for the novel.
Oh, really? Okay.
And you know, it just started with those two guys having that conversation in the car, and I didn't really know who they were, what they did, didn't know much about them except they had this conversation, and then just started thinking, well, who would have this conversation? And that sort of led me to think that they were thieves, and then that they're actually stealing something that doesn't have value, and then sort of had to, I think that's like page 60 somewhere in there,
Yeah.
in the 60s anyway. So then sort of had to go back and write up to that point.
And you know, I'm tempted to read the beginning of The Father, chapter 6.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's a key insight into the whole book. It's just the "we're all born thieves" paragraph or passage. Talk a little bit about that. Yeah, I mean, were you thinking about these ideas? Were they kind of floating around in your mind and you wanted to explore this concept, or is it just something that came with the writing?
It mostly came with the writing, and sort of came with really thinking about these two guys and what their backstory was. I had an old short story about a guy who goes to a diner, young guy who goes to a diner and asks a friend of his father's for a favor. And I had remembered that Chandler did that quite a bit, that he went back and looked at short stories that he couldn't publish somewhere else, and he sort of put them in his novels. And I thought, oh, this fits this character, and sort of reworked that. And then that just sort of opened up to this larger idea of father figures. Again, fate, the narrator's father, is sort of a, you know, small town crook. He sort of works for the city, steals from the city, and he sort of tells him, you know, don't steal too much and you'll be fine. And you know, the narrator does at some point come to question whether he's the individual he is because of his choices, or was that baked in from his father at the very beginning.
Right. And there's this, yeah, exactly, there's this element, you know, our Frank tells him, you know, you got thieves' blood running through your veins, you know. And
it's one of the things that I love about noir, because I do think as a genre, it sort of gets to the important questions in, to me, very interesting ways, but also pretty quickly. You know, a lot of literature dances around sort of the heavy questions in life. The noir sort of cuts to the quick.
Absolutely. But it's funny because this is also a real, you know, the book has that forward momentum. And, you know, in a lot of classic noir, there's that setup where, you know, the character, through, you know, frustration or desperation, usually makes a really bad decision, you know, and there's also that riff of, all right, there's this one last score. And if I can make that, you know, this other life will wait for me. And of course, the setup is watching the downward spiral of that decision. And some of that plays into this, but I don't want to give any spoilers away. We don't really need to. Let's talk about, okay, so the character, the point of view that you chose to tell the story, we see it, if I'm not mistaken, exclusively through Rick's point of view. Was that I don't know, did you have any, I mean, it works beautifully, don't get me wrong, but you're always tempted to think, all right, so maybe if we got a little bit of a view into Frank's head and how he sees the world. How did you come about the point of view?
I think this all goes back to one of my teachers at University of Iowa, who was David Morrell.
Oh yeah,
who
wonderful
people
guy.
know. And one of the things that he talked about was never ever use a first person narrator. So I thought about that here I am using a first person narrator. And he said, but if you do, you should question his reliability. And I think I do that at a couple of times. And again, it sort of goes back to that looking and seeing. I sort of love the idea that the narrator has blinders on in some cases. He doesn't quite see the world as we as readers should see the world. And I like narrators who are wrong, and not just wrong in their choices, but oftentimes wrong in what they're telling you. And I hope that those are flagged enough that the reader at times knows that he is wrong and can see more than the narrator sees in those instances. And then to your point, I think we sort of get into Frank's head and even some of the other characters through dialogue. So I felt like I didn't need to shift inside their head so much.
Right. And we talked a little bit before we went live here about how much we could reveal about their partnership. Is that something that you would like to go into at all, or should we leave that open to the reader's interpretation?
Yeah, I think it's there. And what I tried to do in the writing was also sort of have things on one level that are said, and then on another level that astute readers, which I'm sure you all are, will discover. And it's there. For me, it's there explicitly. Other people think it's implicit, but it's not mentioned much, but it is there. And even the narrator's name is only mentioned one time in the book, which is sort of my nod to Casablanca, which technically not film noir, but if you recall, Casablanca uses his first name a couple hundred times. His full name is only mentioned once in the film. So,
oh my gosh, I missed that completely.
Yeah, so I figured I would mention him one time, his name.
Wow. Who are some of the other sort of I don't know, there are a lot of specific references that are nods. So you mentioned Hammett, and I definitely see him. Was Williford at all in the mix?
Yeah, I really like Williford. George Higgins,
Love him.
obviously. Yeah. I'm a big fan of George Higgins, and sort of went back to a couple of his novels and sort of looked at them and just sort of what he does from scenes. And then Dorothy Hughes, I love. And if you remember, In a Lonely Place, the novel, it's like almost all the action happens in between chapters. Almost none of the action happens during a chapter. So it's like, a chapter ends, and then when it picks back up, something has happened that they all talk about or, have to respond to.
It's great to see her finally getting some more attention.
Yeah, I think for me, she's one of my favorites. And
yeah,
you probably know better than I think she wrote maybe 12, 14 novels, and only 3 of them are in print. And I think only 1 is back in print this year, maybe.
Well, I know they've brought back, In a Lonely Place, of course, the New York Review of Books, which did a beautiful edition of that. By the way, love what they do. The New York Review of Books. I mean, some of their choices have been so good. Fat City, Nightmare Alley, just great stuff. But Otto Penzler, his imprint has brought back Ride the Pink Horse,
which is great.
Dread Journey.
Oh, that I don't know about.
Back the So Blue Marble. So yes, they are slowly being brought back in. But
and Expendable Man, I know, is
yes.
New York Review of Books, which is a great novel too.
Fantastic. Yeah. It drives me crazy, as a recovering English major, is that that these books are not, I think they're starting to be taught in schools, but for a long time they were just ignored, as part of the quote canon. And you look back at 20th century and, Chandler and Hammett and Kane, and all these people, Patricia Highsmith, who we haven't talked about, they seem to me they're just central figures in literature that need to be part of the canon. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but
and which totally makes sense when I tell you this, when you probably know, is, there's an entire book written about Postman Always Rings Twice influence on Camus. And
I'd heard that. I heard that he
yeah,
loved Kane, but I didn't know about the book.
yeah, he loved him to the point that he sort of acknowledged that he stole the narrator's perspective and voice from Kane for The Stranger.
Is
And
that right?
then Sartre was a big Red Harvest fan, and
Mm,
it completely makes sense. I mean, these guys, they did get to existentialism before the French did. And so you can
yes,
see how they loved them, and then incorporated a lot of that thinking into their own writing.
absolutely. Um, so let's see. What more can we talk about? We've gone off kind of into the ether in a lot of places. Let's talk about the basic plot. And as you said, they're thieves. We meet them on this job, and this particular job is a little bit different. We learn than the normal job that they're usually sent on. Can you talk a little bit about that
And
without
so,
giving away too many spoilers?
yeah, so they usually just, it's implicated that they're from a smaller town and they're sent to the city for this job, and which they haven't done before. And because of because of the dead horse in the street, they're put back a day. But the job sort of goes off without a hitch. And they sort of think, like, there's a moment where the narrator thinks they could do this for a long time. Like, this was easy. They got a rental car. They used assumed names. They went in, got their thing. And then it just immediately starts to go haywire. And because it goes haywire, the narrator has to go through a number of hoops. This is a little bit of, like, I think, Jim Thompson land here, which is, he's really put in sort of like a warehouse where he has to work to sort of like try to hide out for a while and get back in the good graces of the boss before he can move on. And again, it sort of goes back to that thing of, like, he's in debt, and the more
Yes.
moves he makes, the farther he gets in debt with these people.
Well, it's interesting because that character, this mysterious, his boss, the one that he's indebted to.
Yeah. Who's a good friend of his father's, and he's known most of his life.
Right. He's this character named Fromer, right?
Yeah.
And he's kind of a mysterious figure in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think it goes back to even though the narrator has known him most of his life, when they meet again for the first time in the diner that I mentioned earlier, he doesn't recognize him. Sort of goes back to the looking and seeing, and he's always sort of elusive. And again, it's sort of the limitations of the first person narrator, which is he doesn't really know him, and the reader should be able to sort of know more about Fromer than the narrator does, who sort of has him miscalculated.
Right. And one of the things that often, when you're dealing with books about heists and career thieves, is that they their own greed, or their own, these classic character defects come in and undo them. And in a way, it reminded me of Spade, whose his primary allegiance in the books is to the job, is getting the job done. And he has this strange, it's no Chandler type of code. But these guys, they're not impressed. For them, it's almost like the ultimate freedom is not wanting anything, not. And I love that about this book.
Yeah, they see it that way, and I think there's a reason that noir really came, was born out of the Depression. And I think that at its core, noir oftentimes look at the things like greed and corruption, And, that made sense in the 30s. I'm not sure there's ever a time where that doesn't make sense, but it sort of makes sense now. And, they do think the two characters in the book think they have sort of a handle on both of those things. They understand that it's a corrupt system, and they believe that they have figured out how to operate within that corrupt world without going too far.
Right. And then let's talk a little bit just about addiction, because it has to do with all of this, all of what we're talking about. It seems to me, there's not just addiction to substances, obviously. There's the consumer culture, the addiction to materialism, but also there's a addiction to, adrenaline. There's addiction to stealing that plays into this. And you really touch on all those things and more. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know where that insight came about those characters, but it's like I do remember when I thought of them meeting in recovery, that just sort of opened up exactly those avenues you talked about. And there are lots of addictions that are going on here. And again, they think they have their addictions under control, and yet, their life is mostly the job. And even though that job might be sitting in a car watching something, they're sort of on the clock all the time. They don't have a whole lot going on in their life other than the job, which, I think in talking to some people I know in recovery, they basically talk about you never really cure an addiction, you just sort of sublimate it in some other way, and that's their sublimation, and sort of that very tight control over the job, and trying to do a lot of casing of places that sort of seems out of proportion with what they're actually taking.
Right.
And that's sort of like, I guess, like a somewhat subversive look at some of those heist films and heist noirs, which is, the meticulous planning to go after, millions of dollars. And these guys are oftentimes going after, trinkets by comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to think what else I can get into that without giving away too much. There is a character named Casey. Can we talk about Casey at all, or?
Yeah, so that's the Frank's sister who comes into the novel, and one of the things about the noir world is, she starts off as a pretty good character, sort of a clean character, and everybody who gets in the narrator's orbit sort of gets corrupted and caught in this trap of corruption. She's one of those people that gets snagged in.
Right. And also the setting in general, like a lot of really great noir novels that I can think of, it's never explicitly stated what we're talking about or where we're talking about. And also the time period, and I think that was really interesting because there are a few cultural touch points, but not many. I mean, it seemed to me that this could be 1960s as easily as 2021. Was that intentional or just something that happened?
No, it was. And, I have to say, it's like, from the agent who had to sell the novel to some early readers who took a look at it, they didn't want it to be a complete, like, hermetic,
Yeah.
no time, no city. In fact,
Right.
for a while I was, going with no names on the characters. Like they thought that would be way too slippery for readers, and I'm sure they're right. But since I was sort of hearkening back to sort of classic noir, I wanted it to sort of have that feel, but also modern. And, somebody had mentioned in a review not long ago that if you strip out sort of cell phones and some of the, Wi-Fi and some of the modern technology that confronts them, then it could take place in just about any time in the noir landscape, that was one of my intentions. And then, I got a little bit of pressure to actually pick a city. And luckily, my editor at Melville House, he loved the fact that it wasn't named, and understood that that is again a sort of a noir trope, and loved the fact that it could take place in a lot of different places.
Right. It's funny you mentioned Melville House. Before we were starting, I was saying how much I admire what they do. Are you familiar? They publish, I don't think they publish them anymore, but there's a British writer that I absolutely love named Derek Raymond. And, for me, he's a key figure that, when he's neglected. But are you familiar with his books? Like He Died with His Eyes Open.
It's funny because I wasn't, and I just had a interview with someone in the UK, and other than Ted Lewis and
Yeah.
Brighton Rock and the what is it, Dave Pierce, that's about my knowledge of UK noir. And the first person that he mentioned was, you have to check out Derek Raymond. So
Oh yeah.
I have some coming.
Absolutely. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Hopefully
Yeah,
Melville
he
House.
sounds like someone I'm going to get along with pretty well on the page.
Well, he writes, just for the people watching, if I can sell a Derek Raymond book, I'm happy to. His whole deal is he wrote about this character who he's a cop, and he's in charge of investigating the murders of people that nobody cares about, transients, prostitutes, things like that. And in the first book, He Died with His Eyes Open, he comes across this body out in the middle of a field, and it's pouring rain, and it's a transient. And as the book goes along, we come to find out that this guy had an absolutely fascinating life, and he was a writer, and he left behind this manuscript. But just very insightful. You'll love him. Great writer. But it's funny. I derailed my thinking. I kind of derailed myself. I was. You don't think of like E.M. Forster as a noir person, but I was thinking of his little mantra, "Only connect." That's part of Howard's End, and one of the things that I identified, and perhaps I'm bringing too much myself to this book, but all these transient material things, and part of what Rick is looking for is a connection, is not that connection. He's not doing that anymore, but family. He's looking for a family. He's looking for relationships. He's looking for that sort of connection.
That's absolutely right. And that's sort of where Casey comes in. And it really is the relationship between he and Fromer, is that he's looking for a much deeper relationship with this boss figure than he has. And a lot of that is of what he does is to please him, and that sort of, the monetary debt he has, the favor that Fromer's done for him.
Right.
But he is a father figure in the book.
But Fromer is kind of like the company store. He owes his soul to the company store in some ways.
He certainly gets paid in company script.
Yes. And one of the things we haven't really talked about, and I don't want to squeeze everything out of the novel so that people won't want to read it, but there's so much going on here. You gave him a daughter, and I thought that was really interesting to add that element into the mix. And this is, his ex, I forget her name, Denise. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And she's, tell me about that part of his life. It's very key, it seems to me. This daughter, Eva.
Yeah, and as I said, it's sort of those obligations that he feels that he has to do. He really hasn't had much of a relationship with her. And sort of the favor that enters into it is, and again, another addiction component is that he sort of gets wind that his ex-girlfriend is sort of seeing this drug addict who he wants to sort of push out of the equation. That's what he comes up with to Fromer to help him sort of remove this guy from the relationship. And then some time passes, and Fromer sort of asks him about the daughter, and he hasn't really developed any relationship with her, and sort of feels like he needs to insert himself back into her life. And part of that is, again, that family dynamic that you mentioned. So he examines the relationship that he has with his father and sort of sees himself as becoming like that, where he's a father who doesn't have a relationship with his child. But also, one of the things that I had was I thought that the daughter was like a great, metaphor and literal component of the past sort of catching up with him, and that what happens in the past doesn't really go away, and that you're always dealing with your past. And that's obviously a role of addiction with people in recovery, but also I thought that she was a great sort of device for that as well.
And part of his kind of journey back to life in a way is, to use that 12-step kind of language, is making amends with his daughter, and correcting that.
And it's also part of, I think that like all of us, we rationalize the choices that we make, and some of his rationalization is that he's providing for her. So he even takes some of the money that he gets, and he gives it to Denise, his ex-girlfriend, and there's talk of well, you don't have to see me, you can just put it in a bank account and we never have to see you again.
Right now, boy, I'm not sure what else we can actually say about the book without getting into spoiler land. Let me see. Yeah, already talked about that. Yeah. Can we talk about the particular object at all? I mean, you do mention fairly early on the little goat trophy.
Yeah. So when I started, I thought that it would be like a Hitchcock MacGuffin, which is, it would be this object that sort of like quickly loses its importance. And then as I wrote the novel, I realized that it became more of a dingus. And then, I sort of had like this oh shit moment, which is I'm getting close to, like, I've alluded to the Maltese Falcon. Now I'm really sort of getting into Maltese Falcon territory. And do I pull back or do I lean into it? And I decided to lean into it. And, there's some jokes about the Falcon later on, but it does become this object that all these forces want to get, just like they got the Falcon. The twist is that this thing is really worth nothing. Ultimately the Falcon's worth nothing, but nobody knows that at the time. These guys know it's not worth anything, but they all want it.
Now it's funny. One of the things we've talked about, or I've mentioned with so many writers, is that either you're a Hammett guy or girl, woman, or a Chandler fan. How do you, or both? Do you like both, or?
I do like both, and they each sort of vie for my attention. I think that boy, I don't know, if push came to shove, I think The Long Goodbye might edge out anything by Hammett. That's one of my favorite novels of all time.
Absolutely.
But the good Hammett stuff is really, really good.
Sure is. Have you ever read Chandler's letters?
Yes.
Amazing, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's fun to compare them with Hammett's letters. I mean, Chandler really, when you get into them, I mean, he just bleeds all over the page.
Yeah.
In the letters.
Yeah. Hammett, I think, as an individual, is much more sympathetic than Chandler. But Chandler had his alcohol issues. He really irritated a lot of people. But Chandler is also responsible for one of my favorite lines of any Noir, is when they were, I believe, working on The Big Sleep, and they weren't quite sure of something in the plot of who killed who.
The chauffeur.
And they called up Chandler and asked him. He's like, hell if I know.
Yeah. Wasn't that was that Faulkner who was working on the?
Yes.
Yeah. It had to do with the was it Who Killed the Chauffeur or something like that? Yeah. And the telegram, don't know, and something like that. Yeah. So he wasn't particularly concerned about plot.
No, and that's what's great about him. And also it's like just the audacity of language that
Yes.
Chandler used in his novels. I mean, it really is like stop in your tracks, and I'm going to read that 3 or 4 times. I mean, some of his paragraphs are just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, with just one little observation, he could tell
Yeah.
you about an entire scene.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who else are some of your big heroes? You mentioned Dorothy B. Hughes.
Yeah, she ranks right up there.
Highsmith?
Highsmith, I like a lot of Highsmith. There's some nod to Highsmith in here. I also like Simenon. He's huge. I just love Simenon. And then also another French writer, Jean-Patrick Manchette.
Oh yeah,
I love.
me too. Have you ever read, there's another French writer named Jean-Claude Izzo? Do you know his stuff?
I just picked up a Jean-Claude Izzo yesterday, in fact.
Really? Set in Marseille. A lot
Yeah.
of way. Just brilliant stuff. Yeah. I love Manchette too. He's kind of reminds me of a little bit of a French Richard Stark with more of a political overlay. In some of the books.
And then I should mention someone who I love, and it's like, it's arguable whether what the hell it is, but Elaine Robbe-Grillet, who wrote The Erasers, which is very much sort of a, intentional subversion of noir. But it sort of gets back to the beginning, which is it's very much alludes to Oedipus Rex, and sort of, I think if you want the first noir work, it's probably one of those Greek tragedies, and Oedipus Rex would be right up there, where a guy goes to look for who committed this crime, and the closer he gets, it's like, it might be him.
I never thought about that, but I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It really does have something for everybody, doesn't it?
It does.
Plucking out of the eyes, the whole thing.
Yeah, and the whole fate, did his choices make this happen, or was it fated from the beginning?
Right. So what are you working on now? Do you have another book going?
Yeah, I'm working on something else, which I probably don't want to talk a whole lot about, but it's definitely occurs post-pandemic, and you'll see some similar themes. And it's basically a guy who feels like he's sort of given all to work, and sort of been the key worker during the pandemic, and when sort of the pandemic is over, he gets fired. And what that leads him to is he's had a comfortable life that is taken away from him, and he decides to go after the boss who has fired him.
Ooh, I like it.
Yeah, so that leads him to make some really poor decisions in his life.
Oh boy, that sounds wonderful.
I hope so.
How has the past couple of years, the pandemic and all that, how has that affected your own work? I know a lot of writers have really, it's been like the most creative, productive time of their lives. And
I wish that were the case. We struggled a little bit because this book was written before the pandemic, and in fact, the agent started to send it out like right at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's like the book's been done, and then we just sort of had to hang fire for a little bit before it came out. And during that time, I did a lot of reading. Did start to work on this other novel, which I've sort of put it post-pandemic, even while the pandemic was going on, which of course it still is, but it's like even while it was sort of raging, I was sort of working on this thing about what life would be like afterward a little bit, just in terms of work relationships and all of that. But yeah, I wish I had been one of those people. I'd love to have like a Simenon burst of activity where I had like 10 novels done in the past 2 years.
It's funny, Simenon, I really love those kind of slippery, subversive standalone books like Dirty Snow.
Dirty Snow is fantastic. Yeah, the Widow, which I mentioned, is great. The Hand, which is really brilliant. Yeah, the McGrays I like, but I really love those, what his hard novels, I guess is what he called them.
Right, right. Um, well, let's see. Oh yeah, I was going to ask you, have you had any nibbles from Hollywood for Just Thieves yet?
I sort of leave that up to the agents, and I haven't heard from them. I know that they've started to send things out.
That would be tricky to make.
I think so. I think so. And I think about a lot of noirs that I like, and there are few that are better than the novel. The Kane stuff, well, Mildred Pierce, which is really, they made it a noir, but his Mildred Pierce, the novel Mildred Pierce, is much better. Double Indemnity is a better film than novella by far. And Postman Always Rings Twice is sort of a toss-up maybe, but there's been a lot of bad films made out of good books, and not so many great movies made out of not so great books. So
That's true. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I would love to see what they could do with it, but I might be, not so happy in the end.
Well, you could just sell the option and just keep selling it. That's the way to do it.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. Although, James Salas, who was kind enough to give a
Oh,
blurb for the book, I think Drive is a great novel and, pretty great movie too.
yeah. Salas is he lives here in Phoenix, and he's
Yeah.
actually a really good friend. Has been.
Oh, is that right?
Has been for a long time. Yeah.
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 Yeah, he was very kind. He's somebody that Melville House thought might respond to the work.
Yeah.
And I don't know him, never met the man, admire his work, but I was sort of knocked out that he provided something. And he also wanted to provide a blurb that was not a typical blurb, which I loved.
Yes. Yeah. No, he's just a brilliant man.
Yeah.
Just a really nice guy too. Great musician too.
What does he play?
He plays, well, mainly stringed instruments.
Mm.
He has a little a band here in town called Three-Legged Dog, and they play around town. And he plays, obviously guitar. He plays mandolin, fiddle. He plays, these days he's playing a lot of dobro and steel guitar. But he's an amazing human being.
Yeah. Is that a Roky Erickson reference, Three-Legged Dog? Do you know?
What? Yeah, was that Two-Legged Dog? Or was it three?
Oh, is it? I thought it was three. I could be wrong though.
Two-Legged Dog. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah. Rocky, did you see that documentary?
Yes.
I love the 13th floor elevators.
Yeah, me too.
But
Me too. Well, that's another show we can do. We can talk about music.
We'll talk about Sid Barrett and
yeah,
Rocky and all the acid casualties.
yeah.
Peter Green.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't get me started on music, Gregory, because I'll just I that's where I take a lot of these discussions, and people are watching it.
Well, it's funny because the first two novels that I wrote, music is a big component of it. And in fact, an early interview asked why there wasn't any music in here, and I sort of said it's like I would have loved to have them sitting in their car listening to the music full blast, but somehow I think that might have blown their cover.
Well, since you started it, I have, forgive me because I have not read your early books. Tell me a little bit about them.
And so the first book was sort of a subversion of the mystery novel. So it's a disappearance that happens, and it was a high school romance. So the boy has to find out what happened to his girlfriend, who has disappeared, and he sort of becomes the detective of the story. And
what's it called?
It's called As Simple as Snow.
So look that up.
And
is it still in print?
It is. It is, and it was published a long time ago.
I'll make sure that we have it in the store too.
And because it was high school kids, it sort of got gobbled up by the YA community, and that sort of became its life. that it was determined to be a young adult novel, which is, you know, you can't, that's fine by me, whichever audience wants to grab onto it, but it has a lot of music in it. She makes him some CDs, if people remember CDs, some mix CDs. And then, so the second novel I wrote was strictly YA, still in the high school world. And then this one, in fact, somebody thought that it might be, you know, a natural progression, because when it starts, the narrator is 18 years old, or at least that's when he sort of goes back to Fromer and needs his help. And they're really probably late 20s in the novel. So, and a lot of immaturity, but they have more adult problems than obviously the high school kids do. But yeah, so I've sort of graduated a little bit, or come full circle, depending on how you look at it.
Well, Anne, who's watching on Facebook, has kind of thrown the gauntlet down, because she says, I'm enjoying the music discussion part. So anyway, so we'll kind of let's just nerd out for a minute or two. Tell me a little bit about your musical tastes. Are you all over the place, I'm assuming?
I'm all over the place. So I worked in a record store when I was in college. Yeah, so I have pretty far-ranging, crazy stuff from just about every genre. Yeah, and still consume a lot of music, all over the place.
Are you back into vinyl?
No. In fact, Anne might appreciate this and have some sympathy for me. I had a very nice vinyl collection that got lost in a flood, and I had probably like 1,500, like, you know, really, really good pieces of vinyl. Everything from like original Blue Note Thelonious Monk stuff to, you know, Blonde on Blonde that had the censored photos in it. Yeah, I'll start crying here if we talk about it too much, but a lot of stuff. So I've never gotten back into it, probably for that reason. So unfortunately, it's like, you know, I've consumed most of it digitally. Although
Right.
I still have like a number of shelves of CDs back there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, I love Thelonious Monk and love all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, Gregory, it's really been a treat talking with you. And I know we've kind of ranged all over the damn place, but thanks for going along with me. And really loved your book, Just Thieves.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
I hope there's enough for people to get a sense of the book.
Yeah, I think so. And you know, Gregory signed some copies, and we still have a few left. So go ahead, and if you want to order a copy, just go to our website, which is poisonedpen.com. And anyway, thanks again so much, and hopefully we'll see you out here in the desert at some point.
I would love to come out there. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Take care. Have a good evening.